Okay, so we're going to start to sew the face covering. There's going to be 2 videos of this, and hopefully we can see a little better on this one. Now, I had the batik fabric cut out, so I just went ahead and used it, and hopefully so that you can see I'm using light colored thread. I have cut 2 of the actual face mask, and this is going to be my lining. You can see the lining's a little bit shorter. But it's going to be reversible. All right, so I'm going to make sure that I have the fabric right sides together. Now, batik is hard to tell, but this looks a little brighter to me on this side, so that's the right side. So I have the right side together, and I'm going to pin that curve. The curve is the first thing that I'm going to sew. And you're going to do that on both the lining and the self or fashion fabric. Is sew the curve first. All right, now this has a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So on this machine, if the needle is in the center position, then the side of the foot, and you line up with the side of the foot, then that's a 1/4 inch. When I first sat down, this is the new Burnett 35 that some of you checked out. So you want it to be in straight stitch, which is letter A. You want it to be a stitch, 9 to 11 stitches per inch is 2.5 for standard medium weight woven fabrics. But I realized that when I move this knob to the right for zigzag width, it also changes the needle position. I didn't realize that because I sat down and the needle was all the way over to the left. I'm like, well, that's not going to work very well. Well, when I put it back to 2.5, 3, the needle goes right back to the center. So I learned something. All right, so now I'm ready to stitch. You always lower the presser foot before you start stitching. And I'm going to back stitch, stitch a couple stitches, couple of back stitches, and off I go. I can move the pins. So you can see this is very easy. I'm just lining the edge of the fabric up with the edge of the foot, and I just steer. I just am driving. I'm not tugging. I'm not pulling. The machine is taking the fabric by itself. You saw I sewed over a pin, but because I had placed that pin perpendicular to the fabric, I didn't break my needle. You always want to, when you sew, you always want the pins placed perpendicular so that you don't break a needle or shag yourself. Never parallel to the seam. All right, I'm just going to continue. 1/4 inch. Try to remember to remove the pins. Okay, now we can try to press this seam open. And when I first started making the face coverings, that's what I was trying to do. And it's painstaking. You really need a tailor's ham. This is an old tailor's ham, but you really need a tailor's ham to be able to get over that curve. And many of you may not have a tailor's ham, although students are very innovative. You could take an old hat, like an old baseball hat, fill it up with fabric scraps, and make your own version of the tailor's ham. But anyways, you can see that if I have a tailor's ham, then it's going to be much easier to press. But you can also just press with your, so I'm going to give it a little press. I'm going to press it to one side. So when I first started making these, I was pressing those seams open, and it took a lot of time. But instead, we're going to top stitch. So you can press it to your seam allowance to one side or the other, and you can finger press it even, because we're going to just do an edge stitch. All right, so I'm going to line the inside of the foot. Now you can stitch to the right or the left, but I ended up pressing the seam allowance towards the right, so now I've got to stitch to the right to catch the seam allowance, as you can see. So there's the seam, and I'm lining it up with the inside of the foot, and that's how I'm going to edge stitch. So you can see I'm going to try to keep my hands out of the way, but I also have to make sure the seam is staying to one side and that this is staying flat. I don't want to stitch any puckers, and I'm just doing a straight edge stitch. So there, I'm getting into the curve now. That gets a little more difficult to maneuver. Little back stitch. Okay, now I saw something. I'm just going to do this one with my fingers instead. So in the syllabus, you might have noticed the first assignment, the face coverings, there's a photograph. Actually, I'm going to press it a little bit since I can. If you can't, finger pressing is okay. There's a photograph of a young man wearing a Burberry plaid face covering. And it's got a zigzag stitch down that front seam, and I think it looks pretty cool. So this one, I'm going to do a zigzag stitch, but that is up to you. Straight stitch or zigzag stitch will be up to you. All right, so I'm going to try to, this time I'm going to center. All right, and we'll have to figure out how, so that's stitch B on this machine is a zigzag. How wide? I guess I'll go to about 3. And I'll have the width about 3. Let's see what that looks like. I'm just experimenting here. All right, I think I need to go maybe a little wider. Yeah, okay, now I'm just gonna, I didn't get that centered very well. Okay, so I don't wanna stitch a pucker in there. So you've gotta kind of flatten it as you go. Let's see how this comes out. All right, so that's a zigzag down that front seam. All right, so zigzag or edge stitch. Up to you, whichever one you prefer. This is a little Hannibal Lecter, but it's still kind of cute. All right. Next, we are going to stitch them together. All right, so we're going to line up those seams now, right sides together. So the top stitch is going to be right sides together. Seam allowance on the outside. Line up the center seam and pin it. And put a pin or 2 to hold it in place. I'm going to leave on this one, I'm going to leave the edge raw because we're going to fold this and cover that with the casing. On the second face covering that I'm going to do, we're going to clean finish the lining edge and leave it open so that if it's another option if you wanted to put a coffee filter, because some people think that the 3 layers is better, you could do that. All right, on the other opposite side, also we're going to match up the seam and pin. All right, here we go. Now this is a 1/4 inch seam allowance too. I need to go back to my straight stitch. I'm going to go back to my 2.5 and center that needle again. All right, 1/4 inch.